Hey, what's going on? I enjoyed making the Archetype Earth video from 2 weeks ago, and it seems like y'all enjoyed watching that shit, since it did better numbers than most of my shitty YouTube content does these days, so I appreciate it. The next few videos, including this one, are gonna be on the Summer 7 servants who've come out recently on JP. From what I've seen, it really seems like this summer's batch of servants has generated a lot of debate and discussion among you JP players, enough to where it's motivated me to make videos about it, when usually I don't touch JP content in video format like this. Like when I stream, people will bring it up, because, well, I'm streaming, and they want to know, oh, what do you think about this on JP? So I'll answer them. But yeah, making videos like this is kind of a new one, I'm gonna be honest. But hey, like I said earlier, I enjoyed making the last one on Archetype Earth, so I'll keep making them as long as I feel like I have something meaningful to talk about. This one's going to be on Proto Merlin first. Specifically, I'd like to address the concern that some JP players have that she turned out to not be as strong as they expected her to be. Some may even go so far as to suggest that she's just straight up bad. Whether it's because her kit's more or less a carbon copy of the original Merlins, or because her kit itself is just straight up bad. Probably the same people who think that, Merlin needs a buff too, but that's a topic for another video. I'll say it right now, just to make things clear and to set the tone for the rest of this video. Proto Merlin is an extremely capable art support servant, if you run her with Tamamo caster. So, yeah, sorry, I lied. This video is actually going to be about Proto Merlin and Tamamo caster. I'm going to have a level 120 Tamamo caster by the time Skahafest is done, so what did you expect? So what does Tamamo caster have to do with Proto Merlin, you might ask? Well, in a server where players have been spoiled out of their minds, getting support servants like Scotty, Castoria, and Koinskaya, who've all established a looping or reloading meta of some kind with their releases, it's understandable that people compare whatever support type servants might come out these days, especially if they're 5 stars, to the meta ones that are already out. So when someone like Proto Merlin comes out, if people look at her kit and think, well, she doesn't have a kit like Castoria's that enables looping, and she's basically just Merlin with a few added goodies, which means she's so 2016 and obviously bad, or at least mediocre. But this is where I gotta tell y'all to back it up a bit, because in the case of art supports, what many players, especially newer ones, fail to understand that Tamamo caster is the original queen of arts teams. No, I don't mean in terms of your zoomer looping teams. Obviously Castoria handles those, and I'll talk more about their dynamic in a little more detail in the video after this one. I'm talking about the good old arts teams that you use for boss fights and challenge quests. And just how is Tamamo caster the queen of arts teams, you might ask? Well, the answer is her noble phantasm. Tamamo caster is the only servant in the game whose NP behaves the way it does, specifically the way it does. A heal, a skill cooldown, and refund for the whole team on an arts NP. The key strength of arts teams, you have to understand, at least traditionally, has been NP spam. When you run an arts team, your goal is to spam as many noble phantasms as possible, because that's just kind of what happens when arts chains in this game give your servants 20% free NP charge every single time. So the more you spam Tamamo caster's NP, the more healing your team gets for sustain, the more frequently your servants can use their skills, and the more often they can spam their own NPs because of the extra refund that Tamamo caster's NP is giving everybody. No other art support in the game is capable of enabling arts teams to the extent that she can, not even after 7 whole years, and I would say this even if I didn't simp for Tamamo caster as hard as I do. So no, Lozangle is not trying to kill off Tamamo caster with new art supports like Proto Merlin or even Shufu, unlike what this guy thinks. What this means is that if you want to run arts teams optimally for fights that don't involve you overworking your Castoria to death, you better have a Tamamo caster as one of your 2 starting art supports. Essentially, for support types in arts teams, you're choosing who you want your Tamamo caster's partner to be, and whoever they are, they help determine how you'll be playing that team. This context of considering Proto Merlin as primarily a Tamacaster partner is crucial in understanding her role as an art support, because without it, as I mentioned earlier, people will just compare her to OG Merlin and think that, oh, she's just a side grade Merlin, right? And hell, some people apparently go so far as to call Proto Merlin a side grade Castoria, which may or may not be as retarded as that time 2 years ago when people thought that Castoria would, quote, replace Tamacaster, but again, another topic for another video. Now that we've established this context, we can now dig into Proto Merlin's kit a bit deeper and see what she's truly capable of. Her first skill is the Arts buff, so she's going to be dropping this on whoever your Arts DPS is, mainly. The max HP increase means that Proto Merlin's giving your DPS double max HP buffs at some point, and this can be very helpful in situations where you're either running an Arts Berserker as your DPS, or if you're going up against a Berserker boss. One note about the max HP buffs, because some people might not understand how powerful they are. When a servant receives a max HP buff, their max HP increases by a certain amount, that's obvious, but it's not just their max HP that's increasing and their current health isn't. No, the buff is also giving them health to go with that max HP increase. This means that you should think of max HP buffs as heals that you can't waste, and so you can use them at any time with no downside, contrary to regular heal effects that you can waste if a servant is already at or near full HP. So the fact that Proto Merlin has two of these things, one on a skill and one on her NP, is incredibly powerful already. The crit damage buff is potentially very strong, if you want to play for it, that is. Again, I want to remind you guys that Arts teams draw their power from NP spam, so the most useful utility from Arts crits is the fact that you're getting double NP gen from them. So, Proto Merlin's crit buff isn't imperative to the team's overall objective. However, if you've always dreamed of having like an Arts Merlin, right, and watching enemies melt with huge Arts crits, like you once did with OG Merlin and with his huge buster crits, right? Now you can. Just make sure to run an Arts DPS with their own star weight buff to help them maximize Proto Merlin's Arts crit buff. Technically, you could kind of already do this with Waver, but, you know, we all know he's kind of on vacation right now, so. Proto Merlin's S2 without the Tamacaster context certainly seems like an inferior version of Castoria's first skill, especially to those who think Proto Merlin is just a Castoria side grade. But the added NPOC buff is huge when you run her in a Tamacaster Arts team. Remember that NP spam is the name of the game for Arts teams. You'll often find yourself throwing out double or even triple NP chains, and NP chains, might I remind you again, increase the OC levels of subsequent MPs in them. So the overcharge buff off Proto Merlin's S2 can affect some of them, which changes Tamacaster's MP overcharge levels when they apply so that they can give your team even more refund and make it even easier for your team to reload their MPs and use their skills again, which includes Proto Merlin's S2 itself, so you can use that OC buff even more. Her third skill is the most complicated, since while it's based on Merlin's own invul skill, the only thing that they share is the party invul. Proto Merlin's version features an enemy charge denial effect for one time and a variable battery for herself that depends on how many enemies are on the field when she uses it and gives her 20% charge per enemy. Because trying to use this skill optimally so that all three effects are being used properly is really difficult, think of this skill as a sort of Swiss Army knife in that you can use it for one or maybe two of its effects rather than all three. Naturally, the easiest way to do this is just to wait for an enemy to get their NP fully charged and then pop it, since the NP charge denial effect will take effect the next turn anyway after they use their NP. But if you're fighting a boss with a 5-tick NP like Riders or Casters, or others even, and they don't have any NP charge skills of their own, so that you have lots of time to get Proto Merlin's S3 back before the boss can NP you, and there are 3 total enemies on the field, you can strongly consider going for a turn 1 S3 to give Proto Merlin 60% charge right off the bat, which, if you stack that shit with her passive that gives her 20% charge for free, and a max mana loading skill, that's a turn 1 Proto Merlin MP right there. Even if there are only 2 enemies, remember that Proto Merlin's S2 will give you the 20% charge that she needs for the turn 1 NP strat. And let me tell you, having a turn 1 Arts NP is amazing when you only have 2 Arts face cards on your first turn when you start the battle. So that way, you can get started on Arts chaining when otherwise you wouldn't have been able to. And if you're only fighting a solo boss, then, well, shit, just save it for later or pop it anyway. Do whatever you want. One thing I will say about the third skill though, specifically its NP charge denial effect, from what I can tell, it seems like it's an actual debuff that she needs to cast onto enemies, which would make sense considering that she's got the item construction passive that boosts her debuff success rate. So even with that passive, since it's only 11% and most magic resist passives are stronger than that, I would caution against relying on this NP charge denial effect to help control enemy NP gauge, unless of course your enemies don't have any debuff resist passives or skills. I've mentioned some of Proto Merlin's passives already, but I want to go over them again anyway because I want to stress how busted they are, or at least the ones that give her MP charge are in the context of the Tamacaster system. We all know how strong the mana loading append is, so the fact that she just straight up gets it for free as an actual passive is, well, that's just great. To put it lightly. And yeah, the fact that you can also subsequently stack that shit with her own mana loading append is just downright hilarious. And it makes the whole turn 1 Proto Merlin MP strat that I mentioned just a bit ago possible without any starting charge CEs that you have to put on her. Again, assuming double or triple starting enemies. We all know how nice the mixed blood passive is. We've all used Merlin at some point or another, and we've all seen how it works on him, especially when he uses his NP to have the 5% charge per turn stacked with his passive, and this is a perfect segue into Proto Merlin's own NP, because it behaves the exact same way, almost. The 5% MP at MP1 stacks with the 5% on her passive for 10% charge per turn for 3 turns, though instead of 5. Needless to say, spamming her MP, especially with Tamacaster support, should not be difficult at all, unless of course you're fighting enemies who constantly MP drain you, and God forbid you give her a limit broken Prisma Cosmos or something. For the rest of her NP, again, the max HP buffs are great, and this time they're for the whole party, making everyone be able to survive just that much better, as well as the 5% charge per turn. The one thing you do need to watch out for though, especially if you're used to playing Merlin, is that these buffs are, again, only for 3 turns. So spamming Proto Merlin for maximum uptime on her buffs is crucial, her NP that is. But that shouldn't be an issue since she should be in an arts team, like I've been constantly saying, where you want to be doing that in the first place. Just don't expect them to be able to stack at least once, like you can with like Merlin's NP though. The crit stars are nice on her overcharge, but they're not necessary or they're not mandatory. You can go for them if you want, if you're running, for example, an Arts crit DPS with their own star weight buff. This means that in triple MP chains, if your Arts DPS is not a crit servant and has a useful overcharge effect, Proto Merlin's NP should be point, your DPS NP mid, and Tamacaster NP anchor. But if your Arts DPS is a crit servant and you value the star gen from Proto Merlin's NP more, then you would make your DPS NP point, Proto Merlin's NP mid, and then Tamacaster's NP anchor like before. This is where I have to address a particular issue that some players seem to have here with, specifically with Proto Merlin's NP. They say that they don't like the fact that Proto Merlin has 2 effects tied to her NP level, or even that she has any vital support effects tied to her MP level at all. Like I've seen this brought up in places like the comment section for Proto Merlin's FGO wiki entry, and even in my own stream, when sometime last week I had 2 guys come into my stream complaining about this exact same issue, this very same issue. Their argument, apparently, if I understand it correctly that is that it's unfair that her NP is set up this way, with 2 strong support effects being tied to MP level. So that must obviously mean that Lazengo is trying to bait players into rolling for higher MP levels for Proto Merlin to make her as strong as possible, right? This is a really weak argument across all fronts. The biggest and easiest counter argument that I can bring up here is the fact that this is literally how MPs work in the entire game, for its entire history. Like, if an MP deals damage, for example, it does more damage the more copies you roll of that servant. If an MP has support or utility effects, the stronger those effects get, the more copies you roll of that servant. If you want to point out examples, Waver's defense debuff gets stronger with MP level, Tamamo Caster's heal gets stronger with MP level, Merlin's HP regen buff gets stronger with MP level, Scotty's attack buff and crit damage buff gets stronger with every MP level, though to be fair, nobody really uses it, and Castoria's attack buff gets stronger with MP level. Like, this shit is nothing new, bro. That's literally been like this for 7 whole years. Yet motherfuckers out here acting like this is the first time they're seeing a support MP have effects scale with MP level. Like, shit, bro. You're basically saying you got a problem with how all noble phantasms behave in this game when it comes to MP level, so how the fuck you gonna single Proto Merlin out like this? If you're still not satisfied with that, let's put it into perspective and take it back 6 years, back when OG Merlin first came out with the release of Solomon. I don't remember anyone back then, I don't know about you, I don't remember anyone back then bitching about how Merlin's healing scaling with MP level was specifically proof that the Lightworks was trying to bait people into rolling more copies of him. Because look, right, he's literally doubling his healing when you get him from MP1 to MP5. Right? Since it's an HP regen buff that lasts for 5 whole turns, you're getting 10,000 health versus only 5,000. Going from MP1 to MP5, 10,000 is obviously a bigger number than 5,000, right? So why did I never hear about anyone complaining about this particular issue back then? And even more importantly, why hasn't anyone brought it up until 6 years later? Like, sure, there are some weirdos who think Merlin needs a buff, but his HP regen effect is probably not on their list of things to buff. And even if it is, it certainly isn't as high of a priority as the rest of his kit, because all they ever think about is how to get Merlin up to the level of Koyan Light. Since we're on the topic of comparing the two Merlins here, let's compare Proto Merlin's NP to Merlin's NP and the contexts in which they're used. They both have the same overcharge of 5 to 25 stars per turn, but Proto Merlin gives a party max HP buff for 3 turns that scales from 3000 to 5000 HP, while Merlin gives a party HP regen effect for 5 turns. And while Merlin charges 5% MP charge per turn to the team for 5 turns, Proto Merlin's scales from 5 to 10% based on MP level, but only lasts for 3 turns. Let's look at the HP stuff first. Merlin's HP regen only heals 1000 HP per turn, while Proto Merlin gives 3000 max HP at the same MP level. It takes 3 whole turns for an MP1 Merlin to match the HP buff that a Proto Merlin at MP1 gives. Yes, Merlin can heal for longer and can stack his HP regen buff if he's fast enough at looping his NP, but boss fights and challenge quests these days feature enemies that can rip apart your servants in a blink of an eye. His HP, or his 1000 HP per turn, Merlin's that is not enough in a lot of cases. It's not enough sustain to recover from that damage fast enough unless you're also running another AoE healer like, you guessed it, Caster. Or if you're in a fight where the enemies themselves don't do a lot of damage, but instead grind your team down over time with DOTs, and so you need that long-term healing over time instead. And here's the thing about managing servant health in FGO. In my opinion, it sucks when your servants are at low HP, and so they're potentially 1 or 2 more hits away from being dead. Because if you can't afford to lose them, your strategy becomes limited, very limited, to keeping them alive until their HP gets back up to a reasonable level again. Proto Merlin giving a max HP buff means that since it's a heal that can't be wasted, right? If your servants do take a nasty hit or eat a big crit somewhere, they're not nearly as in danger as if they didn't have that max HP buff and they're now down to only half their health already and need heals immediately. So in other words, Proto Merlin's max HP buffs give your team buffers to guard against bad enemy hits, so that you can still carry out whatever plan or strategy you had in mind going into the battle, rather than being forced to change it on the fly because, one of your servants just got smacked for half their health because of a bad enemy crit, and so now you're in full emergency mode, keeping them on life support. So in this regard, compared to Merlin's health over time effect, it's well worth the turn limit trade-off and then some. And for the NP regen effect, again, Proto Merlin is meant to be used with Tamamo so that she can NP spam hard enough to keep her party NP regen effect sustainable, even though it's only for 3 turns. The main reason why OG Merlin's NP regen buff lasts for 5 turns, or lasts as long as it does, is so that he can be used in Buster teams where arts chains aren't as frequent, so you don't need to rely on him getting his NP up as often. Obviously, the more he can, the better, but he's in a Buster team, what do you expect? And if you're one of those people who has a problem with Proto Merlin's NP regen effect being tied to her MP level, the problem here is that you're viewing that extra MP, those extra MP levels, as something Proto Merlin needs to be functional, when in reality, that extra 5% that she gets going from MP1 to MP5, yeah, that's nice to have, but it's not something that she needs to be a functional servant. Never mind the fact that most players, if they do manage to roll Proto Merlin, probably won't go for extra MP copies for her, because they kind of want to save their Saint Courts for the other summer servants, and, maybe even other new servants in the future. Because it's either that, or they gotta bust open their wallets to pay for those extra Proto Merlin copies, right? Proto Merlin's NP regen buff is just like Merlin's at MP1, only it doesn't last as long because of Proto Merlin's innate synergy with Tamamo. Proto Merlin already does her job at MP1. She can do it better, right, with the more MP levels she has, but that's a concept that's consistent with every other servant in the game, so again, why single her out? Her Bond CE is the arts version of OG Merlin's party 10% arts buff with a party 15% crit damage buff. It's best used in shorter fights where you want to arts crit someone to death, so it could legit be useful in certain situations. Lastly, Proto Merlin being a pretender means that she has one of the more useful third Appen skills in the game, since she's anti-saber and pretenders have half advantage against knight classes already. It also means that fighting against writers or alter egos with arts teams that have Tamamo in them, naturally, isn't as dangerous, since Proto Merlin won't take bonus damage from them. In fact, against alter egos, she even has full class advantage, again, because she's a pretender. Either way, Proto Merlin lets you only have to babysit Tamamo so that she isn't getting whacked by writers or alter egos all the time. So, to summarize, Proto Merlin is, from what I can tell, a fantastic addition to the art support pantheon in FGO. She's not as versatile as OG Merlin in a vacuum, to be fair, but she doesn't need to be, not only because this preserves Merlin's role as a long-term Buster support, so he has some use in the game still, but also because whenever Tamamo sees a new friend with an arts NP and a triple arts deck, she indoctrinates them into the Church of Fluffy Tails immediately, and that's where they'll hang out for the rest of the game, unless your name is Castoria, and even then. And if you still don't like Proto Merlin's NP for the reasons I mentioned earlier, then go play Arknights, buddy, where potential levels don't mean jack shit for the most part, and ignore the fact that P5 Backpipe exists. The next video will be on Summer Ibuki, specifically the comparison that people have been making between her and Summer Musashi. I don't think it'll be as long of a video as this one per se, but we'll see. Thanks for watching.